When people picture the Odyssey, they usually picture pure fantasy. One-eyed giants, sea monsters, witches who turn sailors into pigs. It reads like a fairy tale, but strip away the magic and underneath it sits something else entirely, a fairly precise memory of a real historical world carried across centuries by people who had no writing at all. Today we're going to take the poem apart piece by piece. The war behind it, the world it was performed in, the real geography hiding inside the fantasy, and the archaeology that, against all odds, keeps confirming details Homer had no business getting right. To understand where the Odyssey comes from, you have to go back roughly 3,300 years to the late Bronze Age of the Aegean. This was the world of Mycenaean Greece, fortified citadels built from massive stone blocks, ruled by warlords the Greeks called wanaks. Mycenae, Tyrans, Pylos, these were real, wealthy, heavily armed places. Nobody had iron yet. Every weapon, every tool, every piece of armor was bronze. This is the actual world. The heroes of the poem, Odysseus, Agamemnon, Menelaus, Achilles, originally belonged to. Here's the strange part. Homer himself lived nowhere near that world. The poem, as we have it, was composed around the 7th century BC, centuries after Mycenaean civilization had already collapsed and been largely forgotten, after Greece had passed through several hundred years of what's usually called the Greek Dark Ages, when writing itself disappeared. So Homer is describing a Bronze Age world from folk memory, while unconsciously mixing in details from his own much later era. That's why the poem sometimes feels odd. Kings who own unimaginable treasure but also personally herd their own livestock. Two eras fused together. The war that sets the whole story in motion is Troy. For a long time, historians treated Troy as pure invention, a pretty story about love, revenge, and a wooden horse. Then archaeology intervened. Excavations at the mound of Hisarlik in modern Turkey uncovered the real remains of a fortified Bronze Age city, one that happened to control the Hellespont, the strait we now call the Dardanelles. Any ship moving between the Aegean and the Black Sea had to deal with Troy's currents and winds, and Troy's rulers taxed that traffic heavily. That made the city rich and made it a target. So the real conflict almost certainly wasn't about a kidnapped queen. It was a trade war. Mycenaean Greeks pushing to control access to the Black Sea, running up against a wealthy city sitting directly on the choke point. The archaeological layers at Troy show a violent destruction by fire around 1200 BC, with arrowheads and skeletal remains still in the debris. Something real happened there. But the scale in the poem, a 10-year siege, 1,000 ships, is almost certainly Bronze Age Greece's actual fleet was far smaller. The real war was probably a longer, messier pattern of raids and skirmishes rather than one grand 10-year siege. Odysseus himself fits neatly into this world as a fairly minor player, the ruler of a small island kingdom, commanding a handful of ships and a modest retinue. For a king like that, joining a campaign against wealthy Troy wasn't really about honor. It was an opportunity, plunder, prestige, leverage. The war really happened in some form. And when it ended, getting home turned out to be even harder than winning it. After Mycenaean civilization collapsed, Greece entered centuries of decline. The writing system Bronze Age palace administrators had used for record-keeping vanished completely. But the memory of the war, the wealthy kings, the burned city, that didn't disappear. It survived through a specific cultural technology, oral performance. The story wasn't written down as it developed. It lived for generations purely in memory and live performance, carried by professional singer-poets the Greeks called oidoi. These weren't casual storytellers. They held a genuinely respected social position, traveling between courts, performing at feasts for kings and commoners alike, usually accompanying themselves on a lyre or kithara. And critically, they weren't memorizing the poem word for word, the way an actor memorizes a script. That would be essentially impossible across tens of thousands of lines. Instead, they worked from a toolkit, fixed epic formulas, pre-built phrases that slotted into the poem's meter on demand. That's why the Odyssey is so repetitive in certain places. Dawn is always rosy-fingered, the sea is always wine-dark, the hero is almost always resourceful or long-suffering. These weren't lazy cliches, they were load-bearing scaffolding, giving the performer a moment to think ahead while the rhythm carried on. The story that became the Odyssey assembled itself gradually, almost like a mosaic, out of many separate songs. Each performer could fold in local legend, adjust details for a particular audience, borrow from older material. And a lot of that older material wasn't originally Greek at all, or even originally about Troy. It was folklore. The motif of a husband returning home just as his wife is about to remarry is a classic folk pattern found across cultures, from Europe to Asia. The trickster who blinds and outwits a man-eating giant predates the Greek epic tradition by a long stretch too. Homer, or whoever that name really represents, didn't invent these stories from nothing. The achievement was compiling a vast body of oral material into one coherent, monumental structure. The actual writing down happened around the 7th century BC, once Greeks adapted the Phoenician alphabet to their own language. That was a real technological leap. A text that had only ever existed in the moment of performance suddenly had a fixed, permanent form. Even then, it kept being performed live for a long time afterward, recited by rhapsodes at festivals and competitions, no longer improvising but reciting a now fixed text. The Odyssey, in other words, is the end product of an extremely long chain of oral transmission, generations of performers preserving the memory of a vanished age and shaping it, slowly, into literature. Trace Odysseus's route on a map and something interesting happens. The story starts in very real, specific geography, then drifts steadily into pure fog. To make sense of that, you have to separate the known world of Bronze Age and early archaic Greek sailors from everything that lay beyond it. The voyage begins at the real Troy, in northwestern Anatolia, and the first stops are unremarkable by ancient standards, the land of the Cyclopes in Thrace, a real region. Greek traders and raiders knew well. But once Odysseus tries to round Cape Malea at the southern tip of the Peloponnese, a violent storm knocks the fleet completely off course, driving it south and west, out of the known world entirely. By the time this poem was taking shape, Greece stood at the beginning of the Great Colonization period, roughly the 8th and 7th centuries BC, when Greek sailors were only just starting to push seriously into the central and western Mediterranean. It's their actual trade routes and first impressions of new coastlines that give the poem's fantastical geography its underlying shape. The land of the lotus eaters is traditionally placed on the North African coast, near modern Tunisia, a place where, according to ancient writers, a real plant did grow whose fruit locals actually ate. The islands of the Cyclopes and the man-eating Laestrygonians are usually located around Sicily and the southern Italian mainland, a place that would have looked wild, unfamiliar, and strangely fertile to early Greek voyagers. The deadly strait guarded by two monsters is generally identified with the Strait of Messina, between Sicily and the toe of Italy, a genuinely dangerous stretch of water for ancient sailors, full of currents and submerged rock. The island of Aeolus, keeper of the winds, is often linked to the Aeolian Islands north of Sicily, a volcanic island chain with genuinely erratic weather, a plausible home for a wind god. Homer wasn't working from an actual map, none existed. Geography in the poem is emotional and symbolic as much as physical. The farther Odysseus drifts from home, the vaguer and more dreamlike the coastline becomes, until real Mediterranean landmarks blur into the ancient Greek conception of the edge of the world, an endless surrounding ocean, home to the land of the dead and the dwelling places of the gods. Even Ithaca itself, Odysseus's real and physically existing home island in the Ionian Sea, has puzzled scholars for over 2,000 years. Homer's description of its layout doesn't cleanly match the actual island's geography, which tells you something important. Oral tradition preserved general orientation points, not survey-grade accuracy, and filled in the rest with imagination. The monsters in the Odyssey read like pure invention to us, but ancient audiences weren't necessarily experiencing them as fantasy. A striking number of the poem's horrors map onto real natural phenomena and real archaeological discoveries ancient people actually encountered. Take Scylla and Charybdis, the six-headed, ship-devouring horror on one side of a narrow strait, and the monstrous whirlpool that swallows the sea 3 times a day on the other. This episode is generally tied to the Strait of Messina, where the waters of the Tyrrhenian and Ionian seas collide. Differences in temperature, density, and tidal timing genuinely produce strong, unpredictable whirlpools there. The most famous today is the Garofalo. For sailors in small wooden vessels with no instruments, getting caught in that kind of current could mean total loss of control and a very real chance of going under, more than enough to give rise to a monster that swallows ships whole. On the opposite shore near Calabria, steep cliffs riddled with sea caves take a pounding from storm waves that could easily smash a ship against the rocks or sweep sailors straight off the deck. Ancient sailors had no concept of tidal hydrodynamics. Any natural hazard that threatened your life got a will and a face. A dangerous strait became 2 monsters, and getting through it became a matter of survival, not navigation. The Cyclopes have an even stranger origin story. Ancient Sicily, Crete, and Malta were once home to dwarf elephants which went extinct long before Greek colonists ever arrived. When early settlers and shepherds explored the island's caves, they regularly turned up the fossilized skulls of these animals. A dwarf elephant skull is roughly twice the size of a human skull, big enough to suggest a race of giants, and it has one very distinctive feature, a large central cavity at the front, which in life housed the trunk. To someone with zero knowledge of elephant anatomy, that opening looks exactly like a single enormous eye socket, dead center in the forehead. Find skulls like that scattered through caves alongside oversized bones, and the conclusion writes itself: savage, one-eyed giants used to live here. From there, storytellers filled in the rest. Cave-dwelling shepherds with no regard for strangers, no law, no mercy. None of these monsters came from nowhere. Whirlpools, treacherous rocks, unpredictable currents, and strange fossil bones all got translated, through the only explanatory tools ancient people had, into living monsters, and then passed down as a way of teaching the next generation of sailors exactly where the real dangers were. For a modern person, the sea is recreation or a shipping lane. For someone in the early 1st millennium BC, sailing a small wooden ship into open, unfamiliar water was a genuine plunge into the unknown. To understand why the Odyssey is packed with witches, monsters, and enchanted islands, you have to see that world through an ancient sailor's eyes. Greek sailing in this period was overwhelmingly coastal, hugging the shoreline, navigating by familiar headlands and mountains. The moment a storm blew a ship out of sight of land, a sailor was essentially helpless against the elements, and losing your bearings that completely tends to produce genuine panic, not calm curiosity. In that mental state, unknown lands at the edge of the world couldn't just be ordinary places. They had to be populated by something strange, terrifying, seductive, or both. Every unfamiliar harbor looked like a trap. Every unknown island looked like somewhere the normal rules didn't apply anymore. A huge amount of that fantastical texture can be traced to one very specific rival, the Phoenicians. Phoenician traders were exploring the far western Mediterranean long before Greek sailors were, pushing past Gibraltar and out into the Atlantic. And they had every incentive to keep their routes and their best markets secret. That monopoly on rare metals and luxury goods was worth a fortune, and scaring off Greek competitors protected it. So, deliberately, they spread terrifying stories in the ports and markets, distant islands ruled by man-eating giants, seductive creatures that lured sailors to their deaths with song, potions that turned men into animals, seas that boiled or vanished into fog. Greek sailors, running into genuinely unfamiliar peoples, plants, and customs on their own voyages, had every reason to believe these stories and every incentive to embellish them further once they got home and started telling their own. That's plausibly how so many of the poem's specific islands took shape. Circe's island, where Odysseus's men are turned into pigs after eating a poisoned feast, reflects a very real ancient fear: unfamiliar food, unknown poisonous plants, foreign rituals of hospitality that might be a trap. The Island of the Sirens. beautiful voices luring ships onto the rocks, likely blends real stories about hidden reefs and treacherous shallows with something more psychological, exhausted sailors in fog or silence, hearing wind or birdsong, and mishearing it as something else entirely. Calypso's island, where the nymph keeps Odysseus for 7 years, gives shape to a different but equally real fear. Being permanently cut off from home, losing your connection to civilization, trapped somewhere, time seems to stop. Even the savage Laestrygonians, who wipe out nearly Odysseus's entire fleet by hurling boulders into a narrow harbor, likely reflect real encounters between Greek explorers and hostile coastal peoples who had no interest in negotiation. All of that, genuine fear, deliberate misinformation, half-remembered encounters, crystallized over generations into a coherent sequence of trials. Odysseus isn't just surviving nature in this reading, he's surviving every rumor, every fear, and every act of commercial sabotage the ancient Mediterranean had to offer. For a long time, Homer's world was treated purely as literature, golden palaces, vast wars, all of it assumed to be invention. 19th century historians were largely convinced none of it had a material basis. That changed because of archaeology, and because of one particularly stubborn amateur. Heinrich Schliemann, a German businessman with no formal training in archaeology, set out for the Ottoman Empire in the 1870s carrying a copy of the Iliad and the Odyssey as, essentially, his field guide. His excavations at his Arlik uncovered real layers of ancient Troy. He didn't stop there. He moved on to mainland Greece and began digging at Mycenae itself. What he and later professional archaeologists found stunned the field: monumental royal tombs, massive fortification walls, and treasure that lined up remarkably well with Homer's descriptions. Gold funeral masks, ornate bronze weapons, precious cups, exquisitely worked jewelry. What's most striking to historians isn't just the general match, it's how specific some of the details are. Homer describes objects that, by his own time in the 7th century BC, had been out of use and forgotten for centuries. That means the oral tradition carried forward genuinely accurate memories of Bronze Age material culture across an enormous gap. The clearest example is the boar's-tusk helmet worn by Odysseus and other heroes, a leather cap covered in rows of polished boar tusks described in careful detail in the poem. For a long time, this was written off as poetic invention. Then excavations of Mycenaean graves turned up hundreds of carved boar tusks with stitching holes, plus ivory plaques actually depicting helmets built exactly that way. Nobody was making helmets like that anymore by Homer's time. The memory alone survived. Excavated Bronze Age palaces back this up too. The Odyssey describes the layout of the palaces of Nestor at Pylos, Alcinous on the island of the Phaeacians, and Odysseus's own home on Ithaca in real detail, a central hall called the Megarons with a great round hearth at the middle, ringed by 4 columns, treasure rooms along the walls, and dedicated bathing rooms nearby. When archaeologists actually excavated Nestor's real palace at Pylos, they found precisely that layout: a grand megaron with the remains of a central hearth, traces of wall paintings, and even a terracotta bathtub that closely matches the poem's description of the room where guests were bathed. The poem's weapons and armor check out too: heavy bronze swords with silver-studded hilts, full-body shields, war chariots, all genuinely widespread in the 15th through 11th centuries BC and essentially gone afterward. Ithaca itself and the neighboring Ionian islands have produced physical evidence too. In a cave on Ithaca known as Polis Cave, archaeologists found fragments of bronze tripods, 3-legged ritual vessels. In the poem, King Alcinous of the Phaeacians gives Odysseus exactly 13 bronze tripods as parting gifts. Analysis of the actual tripod fragments dates them convincingly to the late Bronze Age. Modern archaeologists keep adding to this picture, using soil scanning, ceramic analysis, and underwater survey to reconstruct ancient ports, water systems, and fortifications from the period. None of it proves the Odyssey happened exactly as written. But together, it makes a strong case that the poem preserves a genuinely accurate portrait of Mycenaean material culture. Its architecture, its crafts, its daily life, verified, piece by piece, by what's actually still in the ground. The Odyssey's plot pulls tight for a reason that goes beyond simple drama. For an ancient Greek audience, the central conflict wasn't just emotional, it was sacred. To really understand why certain characters get rewarded and others get slaughtered, you need to understand one specific social law underlying the entire poem, xenia, the guest-host code. In the Bronze and early Iron Age world, there was no international law, no passports, no embassies, no shared police force. Step outside your home city or island, and you were functionally unprotected. Any stranger was a potential threat or an easy target. Ordinary trade and cultural contact between distant places couldn't really function without some kind of formal social safeguard, and that safeguard was xenia. Under this code, any traveler who showed up at your door had a right to shelter, food, and protection, a rule that applied to everyone, from a wandering beggar to a powerful king. Custom required the host to feed, wash, and rest a guest first, and only afterward ask their name and their business. Zeus himself stood as guarantor of the rule, worshipped in this specific role as Zeus Xenios K, protector of strangers and hosts alike. The underlying belief was that a god might be testing you, disguised as an exhausted traveler at your door. Breaking the code wasn't just rude, it was a serious offense against the gods, one that could bring a curse down on an entire household or city. Homer builds nearly every major relationship in the poem around this rule, the people who follow it properly. Nestor at Pylos, Menelaus at Sparta, and especially the Phaeacians, represent the moral high ground. When Odysseus washes up, shipwrecked and destitute, on the island of the Phaeacians, King Alcinous and his people receive him with full honors, gifts, games in his honor, and eventually a ship home, all before they even know his name. That's the code working exactly as intended. When Odysseus and his men enter the giant's cave, Odysseus explicitly invokes the law of Zeus and asks for hospitality. Polyphemus's answer is to openly mock the gods and eat several of Odysseus's men. He doesn't just fail the test, he inverts it completely, turning the sacred obligation of a host into an act of predation. That single act places him entirely outside the moral universe of the poem and, by the story's own logic, justifies the brutal blinding that follows. The second great conflict of the poem, back on Ithaca, is built on the exact same violation. Penelope's suitors aren't simply rude guests. By living uninvited in another man's house, slaughtering his livestock, draining his wine stores, and abusing his household staff, they're committing a severe offense against the same code. They've flipped from guests or even honest suitors into parasites, abusing a host's generosity while simultaneously threatening the household by force. When Odysseus returns home disguised as a beggar, the suitors mock him, hurl furniture at him, and deny him even scraps of food that were never theirs to withhold in the first place. By the moral logic of the poem, the violent reckoning Odysseus and Telemachus carry out against them at the climax isn't simple revenge. It's the restoration of a sacred order the suitors themselves broke first, which is exactly why an ancient audience would have heard their deaths as justice, not excess. Having survived the shift from oral song to printed page to digital screen, the Odyssey remains one of the most read and referenced works in human history. That staying power isn't just about exciting adventures or historically accurate detail. It's because the underlying story structure taps into something remarkably deep in human psychology. At its core, the Odyssey runs on what's often called the monomyth, or hero's journey, a narrative shape that shows up independently across folklore and literature worldwide. A hero leaves the safety of the known world, journeys through unfamiliar and dangerous territory, survives a series of trials, descends into a symbolic underworld, and returns home transformed. Odysseus is arguably the first fully realized version of that wandering hero archetype in Western literature. Unlike heroes such as Achilles or Heracles, he doesn't win primarily through overwhelming physical strength. He wins through intelligence, adaptability, cunning, and sheer persistence. He makes mistakes, he loses people, he weeps on a beach out of pure homesickness, and he never quits. That mix of flaws and persistence is exactly what keeps him relatable across 3,000 years of readers. Home, in this poem, isn't just a building or a set of coordinates. It's a symbol of order, of restored justice, of an intact identity. The long road back functions as a metaphor for an ordinary human life: temptation, loss, hard labor, and a constant choice between duty and momentary pleasure. Another major literary device the poem essentially originates is concealed identity. Odysseus is constantly hiding who he really is. In the Cyclopes' cave, he calls himself nobody to survive. On the island of the Phaeacians, he stays silent about his past for a long stretch. Coming home to Ithaca, he disguises himself as an old beggar specifically to assess the situation and test the loyalty of the people around him before revealing anything. That structure, disguise, observation, and eventual revelation, became one of the foundational tools of Western storytelling, underpinning everything from classical drama to the modern mystery novel. It's genuinely hard to imagine the adventure novel or the literature of sea voyages existing without this poem sitting underneath it. Even contemporary blockbuster franchises and video games keep reaching for the same beats laid down 3,000 years ago: leaving home, facing monsters, meeting a wise guide, resisting the temptation to stay somewhere too comfortable, descending into darkness, and finally making it back to where you started. The Odyssey endures because it hands audiences a mirror of their own experience. A story about a man who, after surviving war, the chaos of nature, the loss of everyone around him, and total disorientation at the edge of the known world, still manages to hold on to his mind, his dignity, and his way back to the people who actually matter to him.